Greetings, everybody, and welcome to Stone of Stumbling, which we labeled the beginning of this podcast series because of the fact there are three major religions competing for Jerusalem. Two of them tend to cooperate, Judaism and Christianity. The third is Islam. And I know, Jason, we were going to do what this week, but guess what?
Yep, we were going to talk about what we could call messianic expectations in the respective religions that compete over Jerusalem. We are looking for the Antichrist. Islam is looking for the 12th Imam or the Mahdi. We're going to talk about this and compare and contrast, but a lot has happened since we made those plans, hasn't it?
That's true, and it's so time-stamped, and the way things are going right now, I figured we better zoom out because what we're trying to do on the show is give you historic perspective as we show everything that's happening, and then take a big snapshot of where the geopolitics is lining up.
So the October 7th massacre.
Well, let's look at what's happening right now first, okay?
Very
Why
good.
we decided to make this change. Israel, a couple of days ago, killed two Iranian generals at the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. They were there in conference with Hezbollah and Hamas terrorists, and it's obvious, we all know, that Iran is the main perpetrator of this war. It has vowed to destroy Israel, and it is acting through its proxies, and they are Hezbollah in the north in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, as well as other forces going on. Syria, for example, the funding is incredibly good, especially due to some of that, we'll put this in kadiddles, humanitarian aid that's been given to Iran that is flowing into Hamas and into Hezbollah and these organizations. This is no longer a random string of terrorists who are just doing their thing and causing a few problems here and there. Israel, however, did cross a line in attacking a diplomatic structure because they were meeting in the consulate of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. And normally, diplomatic structures are off limits, okay? And this did cross a line, so I'm not sure whether that's going to be a good precedent or not. Of course, Iran did the same thing when they held all the hostages from the U.S. embassy back in the 1970s. Then there was a recent Israeli attack on Shifa Hospital in Gaza, and the head of the World Health Organization came out and said hospitals must be respected and protected and must not be used as battlefields. Well, I would concur with that. Now, of course, he's directing his comments at you-know-who, at Israel, right? He unfortunately forgot to mention that somewhere between 600 and 1,000 Hamas soldiers were holed up in the hospital. They had created a weapons stash in the maternity ward, and they were using the hospital as a command center and firing on Israelis from inside the hospital complex. Maybe the WHO needs to blame Hamas for operating out of schools and hospitals and using civilian populations as human shields, which was the goal of Hamas when they started this war. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the WHO didn't do too well with their information during that little health problem we had a couple of years ago, which a lot of what they told us then has been disproved. And finally, believe it or not, protests have erupted in Israel. It's all surrounding the return of hostages, calling for new elections. Theoretically, they'd elect Benny Gantz instead of Prime Minister Netanyahu, creating more division. And it was the division that they did last summer that really was one of the impetus factors driving forward the concept of weakness inside Israel, and that maybe this was a good time for Hamas to do its attack on Israel. And finally, it's something that doesn't seem to be connected at all. Pakistan banned all coverage of the Hamas war in its media to prevent more bloody riots breaking out against not Jews, but Pakistan's Christian population, like happened last August. There are very few Jews in Pakistan right now, but the Muslim community in Pakistan tends to view this as all being merged together, especially since Jerusalem, for example, factors so strongly into Christian belief and practice. I mean, look at how many times Jerusalem is mentioned in the scriptures, and talking about not only the past of Jerusalem, but the future of Jerusalem. So, as you said, we were going to do a segment on the end times expectations of Islam. They're even talking about the return of Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, the Mahdi, an Antichrist. but it's sort of scrambled from the way we look at it. And is the potential for deception going to be bad? So remember to tune in with us again. So where do we want to go from here now?
Well, speaking of the potential for deception, you're going to talk more about this, the role of the WHO, the UN, and the management of all of this conflict. Supposedly, the UN does not take sides.
Uh-huh.
That's what we've been told.
I was gonna
That's
say,
part
what
of, that's
world
part of
do
the
you live in?
narrative. Exactly. I don't think I live in that make-believe world I just described.
No, well, as soon as this whole thing erupted on October 7th, we discovered afterwards a large number of members of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, actually participated in the planning and execution of the attack and were there on the ground killing and kidnapping Israelis. So the lesson learned from this is the United Nations has been consistently hostile to Israel, and it's not trustworthy. Now,
Thumb on the scale.
with thumb on the scale.
Yep.
And this is really important because if you notice when these things happen, okay, this is a media war. It's not just a physical war on the ground between Hamas and Israel, ultimately between Israel and Iran, because that's who's driving this whole thing. It's also a media war because Hamas was relying on the media's Israel hatred. And so whenever facts like this come out, okay, what they do is they briefly look at this and then it's back to bad Israel, bad Israel, bad Israel. We've seen this happen over and over again since the war started.
Don't confuse the narrative with the facts.
That's correct, exactly. And we knew this right from the start. As soon as it happened, having been in this business for as many years as I have, I said, okay, now look, here's what's going to happen. They have got to get the spotlight back on bad Israel, poor Palestinians. And the first time they did this was the hospital explosion, where immediately the Beeb reported that it was an Israeli strike that had blown up in the parking lot of a hospital and killed a lot of people. In reality, it was an Hamas missile that fell short. And then finally, they shifted the issue to the alleged genocide perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. But Israel has been fighting one of the cleanest wars that anybody has ever done. And so when we hear the number of victims in the war, you know, they're saying, look, there have been 30,000 people, blah, 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 and all this. First of all, Hamas is known for wildly inflating the figures. And second of all, they don't distinguish between enemy combatants and civilians. But as best we can tell, the ratio of, say, civilians to combatants killed in this conflict is somewhere between maybe 1.5 to 2 people, 2 civilians for every enemy combatant. The United Nations norm in global conflicts is 9 to 1. So, but the media have succeeded in doing what they said they were going to do, or at least what they covertly said they were going to do, and that was shifting world opinion.
Well, and speaking of world opinion, I had just heard from one of our young people last night, one of the tropes, one of the kind of narrative canards that is brought up is, what about the poor Palestinian people? And something I've noted is that it appears that Hamas is not that great at protecting and taking care of its own people. And that is a big piece of how this is being managed, the deception about that. Who actually is looking after the Palestinian people, John?
Well, that's been a problem since the beginning. There was a poll that was done in Israel as the peace process was rolling forward, and then subsequently during these 20 years, when Fatah, the government in the West Bank, which was the government in Gaza until Hamas violently overthrew it, right about within 2 years of Israel having evacuated from Gaza, and they asked the Arabs who were Israeli citizens living in Israel, when we settle this thing out, do you want to go back and become Palestinian citizens and go back under the Palestinian Authority? 88% said, roll the drum, no. Because why? They understand that both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are hideously corrupt. They don't want to live under that. The Arabs in Israel had become a very prosperous middle class, and they don't want to change that. But you know, each of the Palestinians' decisions since the early 1900s, every time they did something, whether it was the riots in 1920, the Arab revolt in 1937, the rejection of the UN partition plan in 1947-48, it's made the situation worse for their people. Every time they've had a chance to accept a permanent peace in a two-state solution, they reject it, and less of the land gets offered to them next time from what was called original Palestine. And even there, we see a lot of deceptions. And I put together a couple of charts here because if you look at 1937, Palestinians were supposed to get 70% of Palestine or more. The Zionists said yes. The Arabs rejected that. They chose violence and staged the Arab Revolt. 1947, they were supposed to get 45% of Palestine. 50% of Israel's portion, the other half, was actually empty desert. And the Zionists accepted the partition, and again, the Palestinians chose violence. And 5 Arab countries launched a war on Israel. 1967, they chose war again, proclaiming they were going to drive Israel into the sea. They lost the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Now, Egypt did lose the Sinai twice in this whole conflict, but under permanent peace arrangements, Israel has given it back. And in 2000, as a result of the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians were supposed to get about 21%. Instead, Yasser Arafat rejected that, went home, launched the Second Intifada, and of course he passed away under very suspicious circumstances. He was probably assassinated, but that's speculation.
From within his own camp.
From within his own camp, exactly, which is why he said later on, he said, I can't sign this agreement. He got 95% of what he wanted. And he said, I can't sign this because I'll be assassinated. And there was a rich tradition of people getting assassinated who've tried to fix this, going all the way back to King Abdullah I, the grandfather of the current king of Jordan, having been stabbed, assassinated on the steps of Al-Aqsa Mosque back in I do believe it was 1951. And the bottom line is the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Well, this is confusing to Western viewers, especially Christian viewers, where when we think that their purpose is peace, or Hamas, that their purpose is peace, or their purpose is governance, John, what are they really after? And why did they really launch this war?
The whole thing has always been, right since the inception, 75 years ago, is a single state solution, and that is an Arab Palestine.
No Israel.
No Israel. They've taught that to their children, both Fatah and Hamas, in textbooks, which, oh my gosh, have been provided by UNRWA, again, the United Nations organization. It doesn't show Israel on the chart. And a lot of historic misinformation is being fed to them. If we could pull up that multiple chart that's showing the different deterioration of Israel, that would be really good, because I'll give you an idea. If you look at the left frame here, this is 1946 during the UN partition plan. And what it's showing you is Palestine. And so green, the dark green is Palestine. The light areas are areas that would be Jewish controlled and would be the new state of Israel. Right there, that chart is deceptive. It says Palestine. Well, yeah, but they're not telling you that was British Palestine. It was British Mandate Palestine. It was not controlled by Arabs. What they had instead were numerous tiny little villages scattered all over, some Jewish, mostly Arab, or other Muslim communities, separated by large expanses of nada, nothing in between. And so that's why charts like this are very deceptive. Let me give you another perception. If we could have that chart up there about the, this shows the villages. Thank you for that. And it shows the scattering. Most of the orange villages, or tan, were Arab villages, and the blue ones were Jewish ones. And this comes from the period of Palestine's existence under the British Mandate. Remember, first of all, Palestine, as it came to be called, was controlled by the Ottoman Turks. It had been for several centuries. Then ownership went to the British at the end of World War I. Then both the British, the Peel Commission, and then subsequently the United Nations proposed a solution which would just create 2 states about equally divided and say, here, you Arabs take this, the Jews take that, everybody happy, we all go home, right? Well, that didn't work. If we could show the one of the entire Arab world, this is really critical, because you have to put this again in perspective. This is the whole Arab world. When you see these boundaries, those boundary lines were created, many of them, as a result of the San Remo Conference at the end of World War I. And they are boundaries imposed by the Western world. They don't include Iraq here, by the way, on this chart. Oh, yes, it is. I'm sorry. There it is. So that's the entire Arab population. Now, that tiny little squidget of white land there, which is Israel today, that was basically the amount that Israel wanted for its people after 6 to 8 million people had been slaughtered during the Holocaust. They needed a place to go. So they just wanted a little scunch of land, and the Arab communities as a whole said no. But look at the quantity of land that they operated on out of that time. So Hamas's purpose in launching the war, we really need to talk about this, because the media are playing right into Hamas's playbook. And so you're not getting a lot of information. Their primary purpose in launching the war in Gaza was that interest in a Palestinian state was declining through many, many of the Arab countries. They've been held hostage to this for 75 years. They have been unable to achieve any peace with Israel because they always had to link this to some kind of a creation of a Palestinian state. And that just kept everything frozen for all of this time. So Hamas did this. This was not a strategic war to take over territory. They really didn't gain any territory in this. Okay. They were doing a PR war, which would bring the spotlight back on them, because Hamas knew exactly how the Israeli Defense Forces would respond with force. They wanted Israel's violent counterattack. They wanted civilians to be killed. Okay, that's why they operate behind civilians, knowing exactly how that is going to happen.
So even though it was terrorism, it wasn't strictly terrorism.
It's not terrorism. You have to recognize that we had 30,000 well-trained troops, well-trained in a command structure, well-armed, well-funded. This was a military war operation. This was not a terrorist operation, and they planned on holing up in the 400 miles of sophisticated tunnels that they had built with the world's humanitarian aid, and then to use the hostages to buy time for the international community to stop IDF operations. And now it's a time operation, and that's what Israel is dealing with right now, is that the United States and Israel has put a ceasefire proposal on the table for the last month, but it has to be tied together with giving the hostages back. And Israel saying, you give the hostages back, we'll stop fighting. And Hamas has been dithering about that for over a month. And this is what the battle between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu is all about. President Biden is trying to keep Israel from eradicating Hamas, which is following up a policy that we saw back in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where at the time the president and the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, wanted Israel to win, but they wanted them to get a real bloody nose doing that. That was where Israel almost lost. But when it looked like Israel was going to, not only did they go to the west bank of the Suez Canal, but at that point, because the Egyptian army had collapsed, they were able to march right into Cairo. That's when the U.S. jumped in and said, oh, no, wait a minute, you can't do that. So we're basically following the same thing here. And remember that the Palestinians right now might tactically agree to a two-state solution. It would never be enough for them, because they need more territory than just the West Bank in Gaza in order to create their Palestinian state. So guess what they're targeting right now? All right. The situation with Jordan now is in serious jeopardy, because over 60% of the Jordanian population consists of Palestinians. The PLO, already in the 1970s, tried to overthrow the government of Jordan one time, and that's when Israel assisted Jordan in staying afloat, assisted in keeping King Hussein.
John, we've always heard that none of these Arab nations want a Palestinian refugee crisis in their own countries. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. They don't want it. Here's what was happening. The Arab world was decoupling from being entangled with these, they want peace agreements with Israel. They need it. Most of these are Sunni countries. They understand that the growing threat of nuclear weapons and other attacks, more conventional attacks, are being funded by Shiite Iran. And so they had decoupled from that. And what that did is, and that was, by the way, as a result of the Abraham Accords during the Trump administration. And we're talking about Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Saudi Arabia. They wanted out of this. They've been held hostage to it for 75 years. And under the Abraham Accords, It was succeeding. Saudi Arabia is really concerned because they're most vulnerable, sort of on the front line here with Iran, but also their oil fields are in decline.
Mm.
And that's what has made Saudi Arabia rich. And when oil fields go in decline, they do not come back, and they have not discovered any new oil. And Saudi Arabia has figured out that there is not a large global demand for sand. So they need to reinvent themselves. And that's why Prince Mohammed Al Sultan has a 2030 project in which he wants to reinvent Saudi Arabia as a tourist destination, as an investment destination for high tech, and other related things. And he realizes they can't do that if the Iranians are constantly threatening with attacking Saudi Arabia, and the Houthis from Yemen are lobbing drones and missiles into Saudi Arabia. This isn't going to work. He's got a brilliant plan. He's also facing a tremendous amount of opposition internally from religious parties who believe that Saudi Arabia should immediately turn against Israel, and that's that, blah, blah, blah. And this is all based on tribal ideas of honor, this concept. I think the Spaniards picked it up because they're always worried. They used to be worried about honor, and they would let honor drive the bus rather than practicality, where we from Western European countries tend to look and say, well, yeah, okay, I got it. We took a slap in the face there, but this is in our better interest over here. And that's what T.E. Lawrence fought when he organized all of these Arab tribes to fight against the Ottoman Turks during World War I. And you can see why the Arabs are ticked off too. They were promised a state of their own. Well, they sort of got one. They got Jordan and Saudi Arabia. They got the boundaries, but they didn't get what they were promised. And both Great Britain and France knew at the time that this is what they were going to do, that they were not going to keep their promise. T.E. Lawrence knew it too. And he felt really guilty about this because he was a consummate Arabist. He was fluent in Arabic, along with Gertrude Stein. They were fluent in Arabic, and to the point that he actually understood subtleties of regional differences. The fact that he was able to organize them all and get them to stop squabbling among themselves long enough to fight the Turks was a stroke of genius. But when it came time to knight him, he had been summoned to Buckingham Palace, and he walked in, and they had the pillow on the floor and the sword for the knighting of him. Do you know what he did? He turned around and walked out.
Just like that.
He walked out because he said, I'm not, and the queen at the time was really torqued, but he said, if I do that, it will transmit a message to all of my Arabs that I was in on this from the beginning and that I betrayed them. So it's really important to remember that the October 7 operation was not a terrorist attack. The goal was to seize civilian communities, military bases, and villages, and act in a premeditated plan of sadistic slaughter, gang rape, seizure of hostages, and strategic targets. And what they had planned on doing then is to hole up in 400 miles, 400 miles, if you can believe this, of sophisticated tunnels with complex internet and electronic access, etc., while they figured they could wait it out until they got world opinion to turn against Israel, and Israel would go, oh yes, we understand, shalom, we'll back down, etc., etc. And it hasn't worked out that way because Benjamin Netanyahu said, we didn't start this, but we are going to finish it. And that's the fight between Netanyahu and Biden right now.
Well, where does this leave us with regard to future developments? We have Hezbollah on the horizon, and we have a nuclear Iran, and everything in between. What is next, John?
Okay, so I guess we asked the question, is there serious risk of war between Israel and Hezbollah?
And how would that compare to what's happening right now?
It's like this.
Okay.
Hezbollah is far better trained, far more strategic in their plans.
It's next level.
It's next level in the whole thing. It's well funded and backed by Iran. It controls the southern part of Lebanon. So the question is not, will there be a war, but when? And Hezbollah has been asking that question, which is probably why they were having that little meeting in Damascus between the Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas. And that's when Israel, through its intelligence group, said, oh, look, they're all meeting there, kaboom, and took out 2 leading generals, which ends an era of generals in Iran. They're going to have to come up with a new section of leadership. This involves the area along the Israel, Lebanon, Syria border between what's called the Blue Line and the Litani River. And Israel almost launched preemptive strikes with Hezbollah when this started. But Hezbollah was holding its breath to see what was happening. Senior U.S. officials, including President Biden, pushed back. U.S. officials were worried that any strikes in Lebanon would trigger a regional war, and they didn't believe the Israelis when the Israelis said, we may get attacked imminently here. So Israel did back down. Need to understand, Iran is the perpetrator of the violence. They have sworn to the destruction of Israel and the United States. They will probably respond to this attack on their consulate. But the destruction of Israel has been the purpose of Hezbollah and of Hamas. And you know, one of the things you learn in self-defense and martial arts, when somebody says, I am going to kill you, you know what you do?
Believe them.
I take you at your face value, and I will take action purportedly to that. So that's what's going on there. Lebanon effectively has just a very, very weak government, and I would say that Hezbollah right now is the effective controller of northern Lebanon, despite the presence of the United Nations alleged peacekeepers interim force in Lebanon, which is called UNIFIL. I always like all these acronyms. They come for all of these things. Remember that Hezbollah succeeded in forcing the Israeli Defense Force to withdraw from Lebanon in 2000. At the very same time, it staged an array of terrorist attacks against Israel. And since October 7th, Jason, there have been over 4,400 rocket, missile, and other attacks by Hezbollah into Israel, in addition to what's going on in Gaza. But the media are not watching that. They're not reporting on that. There's something like 150,000 civilians from northern Israel who are living in hotels. They can't, and actually civilians on the other side, on the Lebanese side of the border.
John, you know, our team is in Jerusalem right now. Candlelight's team is there witnessing this.
Right.
Pastor Paul and Brenda and our team are there watching the kids riding tricycles through hotel hallways. And I mean, it's literally happening right now. It's real.
Yeah. And so everybody's suffering from this. You know, I don't want to see people get killed in Gaza. I'm not saying let's go in there and get them and the heck with the Palestinians, because they did vote for Hamas. Okay. And today, if Mahmoud Abbas, otherwise known as Abu Mazen, in the West Bank were to allow elections, they know that Hamas would win. And so all of Palestinian territory would subsequently be controlled by Hamas, which would then just use the West Bank for just a nonstop series of attacks going on in Israel. So that's the situation involving Hezbollah. And none of this is stopped. You have to keep in mind, for 75 years, Israel has been the subject of constant, nonstop attack from various terrorist groups, and then warfare on several occasions. There was the war with, I'm trying to think, 1967 war. That was where Jordan and Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. They lost territory. They lost East Jerusalem. They lost the West Bank, and they lost the Sinai Desert, as well as the Golan Heights. There was the 73 war that happened on Yom Kippur. Literally 50 years and one day. It was the anniversary, in essence, of what happened on October 7th, which was supposed to happen on October 6th. So they are well supplied. With Iran stockpiling, they have huge amounts of missiles and other weapons that they can use against Israel. So right now, if Israel risks a war with Hezbollah, assuming that they're not attacked, this would make the current war in Gaza look like a minor dust-up.
But they can't wait either.
That's right. They're on the horns of a dilemma. If they wait, they're just going to continue the war material buildup on the northern border of Israel, and it would just be a matter of time. So it's a very bad situation all around.
John, what about nukes?
Nukes.
What about nuclear weapons? Iran is close to becoming a nuclear power, and they are in this. This is their war.
This is their war. Iran now controls effectively 4 countries in the region, in addition to its own: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And by the way, for those of us here, the regime is already establishing footholds in Latin America, friendly countries to us: Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, where, by the way, in Nicaragua, President Danny Ortega just imprisoned another 12 evangelical pastors there. Both Catholics and Protestants are speaking out against the human rights abuses. And remember, it was the communist Sandinistas, of which There was much religious support for that back in the 1980s, headed up by Daniel Ortega, the current president, who said they were going to overthrow the previous dictator, Somoza, and then create paradise on earth for the Nicaraguans. He's back doing exactly what Somoza did. So that's important to know that. But the latest reports from the Atomic Energy Agency went virtually unnoticed by the media. It's amazing how this happens. Iran is chugging ahead with its nuclear weapons production. It's been obstructing the IAEA inspectors, so therefore they don't have a great idea of what's been happening. But the latest report says Iran has stockpiles of enriched uranium, which are enriched up to levels of 84%, which is really a hop, skip, and a jump to refining weapons grade level of 90%. This is sufficient material to construct about 13 atomic bombs to seriously destabilize the Middle East. The Institute for Science and International Security says that Iran has the capability to do that, to make 13 bombs. Now, in all fairness, it's not quite panic time yet, because they
That's
have to
good to know.
they have to figure out how to put these nuclear bombs, which are different dimensions than I was going to say domestic. I'm looking for the right word. Conventional explosives on the head of missiles that may be hypersonic or not. They would have to test them. They're also going to have to test their own bomb, because typically a nuclear bomb is either, like with a plutonium bomb, a shaped charge with conventional explosives around it to create intense pressure to create the critical mass needed to detonate it, or the old type of bombs we used during our attack on Japan in World War II. It's just 2 blocks of uranium, and that's what they're working on, is U-235, and the explosives just smash them together like that. It's not as efficient as a shaped charge, but they would have to do that. They would have to test it. However, let me unpanic you. I mean, let me repanic you. That's what I want. Yes. I want to repanic you. Okay. And that is, all right, say they didn't want to do it with a missile. What do? Well, you smuggle it into Israel or smuggle it into the United States. And because I think they're just as ticked off at the U.S., and you just put it somewhere in a big building in the United States and set the thing off. And to a certain degree, I don't know if you've ever read Dan Gordon's books, Day of the Dead. Number 1 is Day of the Dead Gaza, then the Day of the Dead 2, United States. And he is a U.S. citizen. He's a known screenwriter. He's retired now from that, but he's still an officer in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Force. And the reason he wrote these novels was to show Americans, you guys are fooling yourselves about what's happening on our southern border. And he said, if I were to attack and destroy a city, and he picked San Diego, how would I do it? And he says, we're just taking everything we know about Hamas and how it operates and apply it there. He says, we don't even need to dig tunnels. They've already got them,
Yep.
And they're running everything in thanks to the narcotraficantes, who, by the way, have a war going in Mexico just south of our border, where thousands and thousands of people have been killed and a large number of Catholic priests have been assassinated. So that's the stage of where we are. Let's take a real quick look, because we're going to run out of time here. Saudi Arabia, we already talked about. They have recoupled themselves to the whole peace process in Israel, but they are running out of time. That's the important thing to remember. Whether or not they're able to hold that, or whether this is just verbiage for political purpose, well, that remains to be seen. And have we missed anything else? Anybody else that we need to cover?
Well, I think you had in your notes, Jordan were, of course, American Jews in this country. Watching all of this, there's a lot that we could still talk about, and then of course there's probably some big lessons we should be looking at in all of this, and there's so much, John. It feels like we just need to keep doing this show until the Lord.
And we're struggling for an Emmy here, right?
Yes, that's right.
That's what we want to go through. All right. The crisis among American Jewry is the fact that typically they tend to vote Democratic, and they're in a quandary. Number one, the main organizations for the American Jewish community basically threw Israel under the bus and sided much more with the Biden administration in what they're doing. Number two, they were stunned by the quantity of anti-Semitism that they saw appear. Because remember the mantra that used to come out, I'm not anti-Semitic.
I'm anti-Zionist.
I'm just anti-Zionist. I'm
Yep.
anti their policy. That was destroyed
Yep.
by this. And so the American Jewish community is trying to deal with it. Just like in Israel, by the way, all of the efforts at creating a two-state solution, that's gone. All right, they're not interested. The Palestinians aren't interested in it. So here you have the Biden administration running over there trying to squash this two-state solution down on everything. And I don't know where it's going to go, but I don't think it's dealing with reality. Any other areas?
Well, look, I'm already just thinking about the collapse of the narrative, and this is, to me, as a pastor and as a Christian, I cannot help but just notice how much of the deception, it ought to be becoming harder to maintain. All of this is part of a narrative that, as you've noted before, is collapsing. It's coming apart. The slogans increasingly are meaningless.
Right. Irrelevant.
Yeah, they're irrelevant anymore, and you can keep touting them, but it's like the mask of anti-Zionism has come off to reveal these anti-Semitism for what it is. And John, what does this matter? How does this matter to Christians today, who still probably many of American Christians would prefer to keep our heads in the sand? But these events that you've been describing will not let us.
They will not let you. That's the first thing. I remember when I interviewed Artur Pawlowski a couple of years ago, and we sat together face to face like we're doing here. And I'm looking at him. His face is so Polish because he was born in Poland. And I'm looking at it and these steely blue, determined eyes that he had. And as I'm doing the interview, you're always thinking things. And I thought, they picked the wrong Polish pastor to pick on here. He was not going to back down. But he told me something very, very important. The time of pastors being able to hide from the issues now confronting us, persecution of the church and political issues, that's all gone. And you're going to have to pick a side. You will not have the luxury of trying to wiffle waffle down the center. That will not be allowed. And then we're going to determine, as he said, who the real Christians are and who the fake Christians are by what we do. And Richard Vornbrand said that too, by the way. He said in churches there are two groups of people. There are those who think they are Christians. They walk the walk, they talk the talk, they sort of look and sound like they're Christians. He said, and then there are the real Christians. And the only time you'll ever know the difference is in a time of crisis. And then by what they do, not by the words coming out of their mouths. And so I think we're going to see that today. We have passed through a watershed event, both for the church in the West and for what's going on in the Middle East, and things are evolving very rapidly. So we need to take a side, be wise in what we do, don't die defending stupid hills, pray for the persecuted church. But as the Apostle Paul says in all of his letters, everything he talks about are aggressive words: run, contend, defend, stand. All of these things are critical, not duck, hide, and just use preaching the gospel as an excuse for not defending the faith. So that's my end of that. And if you want to throw tomatoes at me, feel free to do it. So anyway, that's been it today. We felt we had to do this. Next time, I'm not going to promise, because if things really blow up again, we may have to do it. But we already have a structure for looking at Islamic eschatology and end times expectations versus Christian and, to a certain degree, Jewish expectations. So on behalf of the Right Reverend Dr. I wouldn't even say it. Dr. Jason, I'm John Loeffler. And thanks for joining us. Be safe. Pray for the persecuted.